kind of four people that really strongly influenced me in that day. There was a writer named Felix Singer who wrote novels and short. Well, I don't know if he ever completed a novel. He wrote mostly short stories and poetry and that sort of thing. And I met Eddie Belchowski through Felix. Felix was always down and out. He was always doing sort of menial jobs because he had such high artistic standards that somebody would be interested in publishing one of his short stories, and they had a few suggestions for revisions they want to make, and of course Felix would completely block. No, I wrote it the way I want to have it. Nobody edits it, so editors wouldn't have anything to do with it, because there's almost no writer that that gets published whole the way it was originally appeared in the original manuscript. Anyway. There were two other guys just peripherally that I knew at that time. They were all kind of vaguely friends. Karl Mayr, who was a very strong radical, working with the Catholic Worker, and Geoffrey Stewart, who was I would call him a violent pacifist. he was kind of the original conspiracy monger. I mean, the whole world was being controlled by the Jewish bankers and the Illuminati and all that kind of stuff. But he was always, dirt poor, had just barely every penny he made he put into mimeographing these long tracts that he would have under his arm, and he would walk along at any rally like the College of Complex and stuff and passing out this stuff like crazy. I think most people use it for toilet paper or something, but anyway, but these four people had strong early influences on me, and I probably better just to focus on Eddie's influence. The interesting thing about Eddie was, again, a man who kind of followed his own vision, his own lights as to where to go. And I was always impressed with his amazing vitality. Even if he was depressed, he was wild and he really was kind of a wild man. Always, of course, completely disheveled, half-torn clothing, paint smeared on one arm and down the other, maybe a bruise or a cut where somebody had rolled him or something. And but he seemed to, even through his depression, seemed to be wildly optimistic because he was obsessed with his work. His artwork was always, for him, the most important thing. It was more important than life, more important than food, more important than sex, probably more important than survival. And the interesting other element of it was I didn't even care for his artwork that much. I wish I could. I think some of it's actually of some value these days because I have probably somewhere countless drawings. Every time I'd see him, he'd give me a couple drawings, just like Geoffrey Stewart passing out his tracts. Eddie was always scrawling these things in charcoal or crayon or whatever he could get, his blood if he had to, and handing them out to people. He was just voracious in his production. He kind of taught me how to do monoprints, which is you smear glass with some ink and you drop a page on it and pull it off, and that's your monoprint, one print, whatever. But I think Eddie taught me the essence of what it is to be an artist. Almost independent of results. It's a little like Buddhism. If you do a pure act, once it's done, you don't give a crap what happens to it or who likes it or who doesn't like it. It's an expression of who you are at that moment and your particular way of thinking and where you are at that moment. And as I say, I wasn't all that impressed with his art. He did have talent. I mean, he could draw realistically, but it always seemed like he was on the verge of just going out of control. And at that time, when I was studying art, it seemed just too schizophrenic and too wild for me. But I was able to see the vision that he had in a strange way. And he was also doing something else that was interesting. He was always kind of playing with his own mind, reprogramming himself in a strange way. And I had never really quite heard of anybody doing that. I mean, I know like people like Fritz Perls and the Human Potential Movement, which was in its infancy at that time, talked about that idea of reframing, reprogramming. But Eddie was actually doing it. I mean, I remember him, walking up to me or something on the street. I mean, I always run into him walking around on the street. And he would say that Well, this morning I got up and I decided instead of getting out of that side of the bed, I rolled over and pushed the bed away from the wall and decided from now on I was going to get up on the other side of the bed because he believed that habit was like death. Once you got into a habit, it was a process of dying. You always had to break the narcotic effect of habit. And I mean, speaking of narcotics, he also claimed to have kicked heroin cold without without having to go to jail or going into a rehab program. Um, I don't know if he ever really fully kicked it. I didn't have much contact with him like the last 15 or 20 years of his life. I think he died in 1989. But he always was stronger than his addictions, stronger than his appetites in a strange way, and he had a kind of freedom in that it was hard to say. And I think one of the problems we have with our heroes is we expect them to be entirely creatures of light. Well, Eddie was not entirely a creature of light. I mean, he was a con man. He was, he reminds me a little in some ways of Alec Guinness' portrayal of The Horse's Mouth, James Carey's marvelous novel with one section there. Because he was kind of most artists I've known have been kind of this mixture of genuine magic and also showmanship. And Eddie had a real quality of self-promotion and showmanship, kind of his attention to his myth in a way, which was largely manufactured. And a number of artists that I've known have had that quality. It's it's a funny kind of dichotomy. But as I say, I've had sort of off and on contact with him. I remember the last time I actually saw him was, I think, a couple of years, about 2 or 3 years before he actually did die. My first wife and I were like in Chicago or something. We were living in the suburbs, and I ran into him at the Busy Bee up on, I think it's like Armitage and Damon or something. Anyway, it was like his famous haunt. And I mean, he was more interested in my first wife at that time because she was pretty gorgeous. But it was interesting to see him. I mean, he had aged considerably and was even wilder than he was back in the '60s. But I maintained sort of a little bit of. I followed his progress a little bit through a friend of mine, Lynn Ehrlich, who was a photographer who also shot a number of photographs of Eddie throughout the years. And I had a conversation with Lynn after Eddie had died, in which Lynn said that it wasn't certain whether Eddie actually had been pushed off the subway platform. What happened was he was run over by a subway train, and whether he jumped, was pushed, or fell is kind of up to conjecture.
I remember that. I think. What year was that?
89.
Yeah, I was living in town.
Yeah.
And I remember we had no context. It was in the paper.
Yeah. I interviewed everybody else. But Lynn's feeling was that Eddie committed suicide. That he felt, because he said that he had seen him the week before or whatever, and he was very depressed. Part of it is, he didn't have Social Security or any
safety net,
any kind of safety net to fall back on, and his health had deteriorated some. I mean, he was in a certain amount of pain, and and just generally as you get older, your energy level drops, and the enthusiasms and passions of youth often just fall under the juggernaut of inertia and the drug of dreams, or whatever you might want to call it. And he felt that it was kind of like it was either that or just continue in a downward spiral from there, which would have resulted in nothing. So it's kind of like the Hemingway option, where you cannot live in the style to which you're accustomed to living, and the alternative is really intolerable. So you take that route out. I got to get some water.
Right.
Yeah.
That was my connection.
Well, Eddie is probably most famous for being the sort of janitor at the Quiet Night North Side establishment that was famous for playing folk music. A lot of guys started out there, and then like after hours he would play the piano. And a lot of people remember him. I mean, the most famous one I think is Jimmy Buffett wrote a song about Eddie, which you might want to look into. You know,
Interesting.
it's kind of interesting. I mean, he's now he's finally memorialized in the cemetery. What is the cemetery?
Yeah, Waldheim.
Waldheim Cemetery, where I guess there's actually a monument to the martyrs of the.
Well, that's the communist. The cemetery, that section, Emma Goldman is there.
Ah.
That was the section that was owned by the Communist Party.
Ah.
And to get in there, you had to be approved by whoever made approved it.
Yeah.
And that's when I went to the memorial.
Mm-hmm.
That was right there by his, where
Right.
the area he was buried.
Yeah.
Huh.
But
Could you actually have a conversation with him?
with Eddie, all the time. I mean, we hung out for, I would say from, 65 to 70, something like that.
Oh.
No, I mean, he was like, I mean, I didn't have a car at the time. Excuse me. But, I'd always run into him like on LaSalle Street or on the near North Side or something like that. He was always like sort of from one place to another, He'd stay with somebody and then they'd kick him out and he'd have to go find something else.
Yeah, he stayed with Sid Harris, where I asked Mimi Harris, and she said, "Oh yeah, he always used to come around.
Mm-hmm.
He was always hanging around the house, coming to visit."
Yeah.
But I mean, what would be the character of a conversation about a book, about an idea,
Yeah,
about
usually,
a political event?
As I said, he would. I don't really recall much in the way of politics. It was more about he would have some wild idea that he wanted to discuss, and a lot of times it would have to do with some new discovery he would make. In fact, I think in the video that I had referred you to, he spoke about this kind of what I would call this neuro-linguistic programming that he was doing. I mean, he wouldn't probably even recognize it as that, but he said that the way he tried to get himself off of heroin was that he would go through the whole ritual, and in the video, he had this discussion with me too, but he recounts it in the video where he would cook up the heroin and inject it, get the syringe, and then he said just before he would insert the needle in his vein, he would suddenly like make a really loud noise and recreate the worst experience of being arrested and thrown into prison. So instead of having a positive reaction to the use of the heroin, he would then start associating with negative things as opposed to pleasurable stuff.
Yeah.
And that's how he claimed he was able to actually cure his addiction. And again, that's kind of a programming, like a self-programming in your mind. And I'd never heard of this kind of thing in the past, but
you just see the pictures of people doing it.
Yeah.
But you really don't know what's going on.
But
That's
actually, they therapists have said that a big part of the whole addiction thing, especially with things like heroin and cocaine to a certain extent, are the ritual that reinforces it. It's everything goes into setting it up. It's a little like like preparing a wonderful steak and seasoning it and doing all this stuff and then throwing it in the garbage. I've gone through all this wonderful preparation and now this is just the the cream on the coffee or whatever. But his whole idea was to start to develop Pavlovian negative connotation
to get off of it.
To get off of it.
Oh.
So the part of the idea is, once you sort of start down that road of the outfit, as they call it, the preparation, it's real hard to back off from that. So he started backing off from that and thinking, associating with negative things.
And you think he conquered it?
Yeah, well, he claimed to, although it's really funny, about a week after one of his claims that he had kicked it, I went, he had like a studio back, a garage on Damon or something like that. And I went by his studio, I saw the light was on, and I was sort of going by in the alley, and I looked in the glass, and here was Eddie, tied up, shooting up.
Oh.
And, oh yeah, you know. So I mean, everything he said you had to take with a grain of salt. And as I say, everybody has heroes that they kind of worship, but they do it sort of by doing violence to the dark side of them or to the contradictory side of them. Whereas I've always sort of had heroes that are real mixtures. I mean, I've had some bizarre heroes in my life, and Eddie was one of them.
Yeah.
Another one was the poet Paul Carroll, who I thought was he is my favorite poet. I mean, contemporary poet that I've actually met, and you know, I made a film about him and stuff like that. But I mean, God, terrible man in many respects. He was a misogynist. He was an alcoholic. He was a complete egomaniac. Wouldn't bridge any. You know, when he was in his cups, he would become very violent. You know, so how can you have a hero like that? Well, I'm sorry. All human beings are a mixture of light and dark, and to suddenly expect everybody to this is one of our political problems. You know, every
Well, go back to Eddie.
Yeah.
Was he well read? Did he read?
I don't know how much he read. He always had references to things. He had he had a lot of, I mean, obviously had a lot of references to socialist thinkers and communist thinkers and stuff, partially as a result of his
Right.
work with the Lincoln Brigade. And I mean, this is a role that he cultivated. He got a lot of mileage out of it. You know, I mean, especially being wounded. He was actually, as far as I understand, he was shot by a sniper. It wasn't like in combat. What he was doing was, apparently he was up scouting. He had binoculars. He explained this. He had binoculars, and a sniper, I think it was a German, because they had like German mercenaries working for the fascists, you know, preview things to come.
Right.
And the bullet struck him like on the elbow and like tore off his arm. And he said all he remembered was this fountain of blood as he fell back. I mean, in a sense, it was, he was I don't think he'd even been in the Lincoln Brigade that long. I think it was like
It
the second.
tore off the whole arm?
Well, I think it shattered the bone. I mean,
Oh.
I'm sure that probably his hand was
Yeah.
there, but I mean, back then it was amputation. That's a field hospital, you do that. And I mean, he had, I would say maybe not a universal knowledge, but he had, spotty areas of knowledge that he would quote. He would quote a poet or something like that. He, of course, had a universal knowledge of music. I mean, Chopin, Beethoven, the famous etude that was written for the left hand or something like that. I guess he discovered, and that's what got him back into the piano.
Well, on this tape that I have, they brought in a tape, and they played it.
Oh.
And so you could actually hear him
Yeah.
playing something. Did he relate well with younger people?
I think probably mostly with the younger people, because I think his contemporaries were, unless they were like old radicals or something like that. I mean, he was kind of a Pied Piper. He always did tend to seek out younger people. I mean, he loved women too. He always had some. I mean, the guy had to be. I don't. He had a certain magnetism, but I can't think of him as being necessarily a stud. It's not like Harvey Keitel or somebody like that. Sean Penn or something, an older guy who has a certain attractiveness. He wasn't necessarily all that attractive, but he seemed to be able to acquire young women.
Easily.
I every so often see him walking with a young woman on his good arm.
Did he ever express any disillusionment with the Spanish Civil War? Because there have been a lot of books
Yeah,
came out
yeah.
about how people were manipulated by
Right,
communists and how they
Yeah.
killed the anarchists and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
I don't really recall, because part of it, I think the Spanish Civil War was kind of a defining moment for him. I think he exploited it to a certain extent. It's kind of like obviously he'd never been in combat before or since, so quite often soldiers the sense of aliveness you get in that situation. I mean, for me, it was Democratic convention, being chased down the street by police. God, the adrenals were working like crazy. I mean, more alive than I've ever been in my life. And I think that was the quality that he expressed in that, and it was kind of a reliving of that. About other political stuff, you know, like Stalin, I don't know if he was like a devout Stalinist. I mean, a lot of the, you know, I mean, it's sad that the left was so disenfranchised by many of the people on the left refusal to renounce Stalin. I mean, they hung on to Stalin until it was completely untenable. I don't think he. I never heard him talk much about Stalin or about you know, the Soviet Union. But again, a lot of my stuff mostly restricted to, you know, his psychological experiments and his artwork too.
That's interesting. Okay, well, we got 7 minutes left.
Right.
Is there anything else? That was very interesting. Great